The world did not end with a bang for the people of the Philippines in December 1941, but with the low rhythmic drone of Mitsubishi Type 0 engines echoing across the Leyte Gulf. It was a sound that curdled the milk in the jugs and sent the birds screaming from the mahogany trees long before the first shadow of the rising sun fell upon the soil of Tacloban. For Nieves Fernandez, a simple schoolteacher in the bloom of her life, the war was a distant rumor of thunder until the lightning finally struck the roof of her classroom. She was a woman of order and discipline, a woman who believed that the stroke of a pen and the wisdom of a book could forge the future of a nation. But the men in the mustard yellow uniforms who marched through the dust of the village square had no interest in books or the children who read them. They brought with them the stench of scorched earth and the cold, calculated arrogance of an empire that believed it was ordained by heaven to crush the weak under the iron heels of its jackboots. As the smoke from bombed-out harbors drifted inland, Nieves watched from the shadows of her schoolhouse as the world she had built was methodically dismantled by soldiers who viewed the local population as nothing more than obstacles to be cleared or cattle to be worked into the dirt. The occupation was not merely a change in administration, it was a systematic erasure of human dignity that began with the smallest of insults and ended in the deepest of graves. When the Imperial Japanese Army finally rolled into the heart of the community, they sought to make an example of those who held influence over the minds of the people. Nieves Fernandez was not a soldier, she was not a politician, and she was not a revolutionary, but she was a teacher, and in the eyes of the invaders that made her dangerous. They dragged her from the quiet sanctuary of her classroom in front of the very students she had sworn to protect. The Japanese officers stood in the heat of the midday sun, their white gloves stained with the sweat of conquest, and they looked at Nieves with a sneer that would haunt her dreams for decades. To them she was a joke, a soft, fragile creature in a long floral dress who belonged in the kitchen or the laundry room. They laughed as they went through her meager belongings, tossing her books into the mud and treading upon the pages with their heavy boots. One officer stepped forward, his face a mask of bored cruelty, and began to mock her, calling her a useless old auntie who thought she could stand tall while the emperor reigned supreme. The psychological warfare was only the beginning, as the invaders soon turned to physical brutality to break the spirit of the woman in the dress. In an act of senseless sadism, they restrained her in the center of the square and brought forth containers of scalding water intended for the camp kitchens. While the soldiers jeered and the villagers watched in a paralyzed state of horror, they poured the liquid fire over her skin. The pain was an incandescent white roar that threatened to swallow her consciousness whole, but Nieves did not give them the satisfaction of a scream. She felt the skin on her arms and shoulders blistering under the heat, yet her eyes remained fixed on the officer who led the interrogation. This was their mistake. They saw a victim falling to her knees. They saw a woman broken by the weight of their power, but they failed to see the transformation taking place beneath the surface. The heat of the water did not break her, it tempered her. It burned away the schoolteacher, the civilian, and the pacifist, leaving behind a core of cold obsidian and a hatred so pure it could have powered a locomotive. As she lay in the dust after they had finished their sport, Nieves watched the soldiers walk away without a single backward glance, convinced that she was no longer a threat. They left her with her scars and her silence, never realizing they had just birthed their own executioner. By the time the sun set on that day of infamy, the woman who had walked into the square was dead, and something far more lethal had crawled out of the wreckage. Nieves knew that she could not fight an empire with textbooks and chalk, so she turned her gaze toward the emerald darkness of the jungle that fringed the edges of the town. She understood with a chilling clarity that the only language the invaders spoke was the language of the grave, and she intended to become fluent in it. The insult of being underestimated became her greatest tactical advantage. The Japanese regulars continued to patrol the trails around Tacloban with a sense of utter security, convinced that the local women were too terrified to even look them in the eye. They did not notice when the schoolteacher disappeared from the village, nor did they care. When a few dozen young men followed her into the thickets, in the humid depths of the Leyte brush, Nieves Fernandez began to build an army of ghosts. She traded her floral dresses for the dark, rugged attire of a hunter and her pens for the cold steel of a bolo knife. The abyss had looked into her and found a reflection that was even darker than the void itself. The transition from educator to insurgent was not a matter of choice, but a matter of mechanical and biological necessity. Nieves realized early on that her band of rebels could not rely on the scraps of the retreating United States forces or the hope of a distant liberation that might never come. They were alone in the green hell of the interior, and they needed teeth. This was the beginning of what the locals would whisper about as the heresy of the gas pipe. Nieves possessed a sharp, analytical mind that had once been used to solve algebraic equations, but now she applied it to the physics of ballistics and the chemistry of destruction. She gathered her followers and instructed them to scavenge every piece of scrap metal and discarded hardware they could find in the ruins of the coastal towns. The centerpiece of her improvised arsenal was the latong, or the gas pipe gun, a weapon born of desperation and refined by the cold genius of a woman who had nothing left to lose. They took heavy gauge iron pipes, meant for plumbing, and reinforced them with wire wraps and wooden stocks carved from the hardest mahogany. These were not the elegant rifles of the Imperial Guard, but they were crude, effective, and utterly terrifying at close range. Meticulous as a watchmaker, Nieves spent her nights by the light of a flickering oil lamp, studying the properties of black powder and the ignition points of improvised primers. She taught her men how to pack the pipes with a lethal cocktail of ground charcoal sulfur and saltpeter harvested from the guano in the local caves. For projectiles, they used whatever the earth provided, from jagged pieces of lead, stripped from old batteries, to handfuls of rusty nails and crushed glass. Each weapon was a ticking time bomb and a testament to the ingenuity of the oppressed. She called them her long guns, and though they had a tendency to kick like a mule and obscure the battlefield in a thick cloud of acrid white smoke, they were more than capable of tearing a man in half at 20 paces. Nieves did not just build the guns, she lived them. She practiced until she could feel the weight of the powder in the palm of her hand and judge the integrity of a weld by the sound it made when struck. She was no longer just a leader. She was the master armorer of a shadow war, designing tools of death that the Japanese military manuals had never bothered to account for. The isolation of her command was absolute, as the Japanese had cut off all communication between the islands. Nieves stood at the center of a web of 110 men, many of whom were her former students, or the fathers of the children she had taught. They looked to her not out of a sense of traditional military rank, but because she was the only one who didn't flinch when the sound of Japanese boots thudded on the forest floor. She drilled them in the art of the ambush, teaching them to move through the undergrowth without disturbing a single leaf and to wait in the suffocating heat for hours until the target was within the killing zone. She instilled in them the philosophy that a soldier in a dress or a soldier in rags was still a soldier if they held the trigger. The technical depth of her training went beyond the weapons themselves. She taught them how to maintain the gas pipes in the constant moisture of the jungle, using pig fat as a lubricant and recycled cloth as wadding. Every piece of equipment had to be perfect, because in the coming crucible there would be no room for a misfire. The schoolteacher was gone, replaced by a captain of the resistance, who understood that the only way to save her people was to become a monster, more efficient than the ones who had invaded her home. The heresy of her methods extended to the very way she perceived the battlefield. While the official resistance movements were waiting for orders from General Douglas MacArthur and the High Command in Australia, Neves acted on a timeline dictated by the movements of the enemy. She studied the supply lines of the Imperial Japanese Army with the same intensity she once used to grade history papers. She mapped out every outpost, every bridge, and every trail that the occupation forces used to dominate the region. She knew that the Japanese soldiers viewed the Filipino landscape as a hostile alien world, but to her it was a classroom, and she was ready to give them a lesson they would not survive. She watched from the ridges as the arrogant officers rode their horses through the valleys, laughing and smoking, while her men waited with their gas pipes and their bolos. The psychological weight of her solitude was immense, as she knew that one mistake would lead to the execution of everyone under her command. Yet she felt a strange sense of peace in the dark. The woman in the dress had been a lie, a mask for a warrior that the world was finally about to see in the bloody light of the morning. The first time the gas pipe sang was not in a moment of glory, but in a moment of suffocating tension that threatened to snap the sanity of every man hidden in the ferns. The target was a small logistics detail consisting of 3 Japanese regulars and 2 local collaborators moving toward a supply cache near the foothills of South Leyte. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the incessant drone of cicadas, which seemed to mock the silence of the waiting guerrillas. Neves Fernandez stood at the front of the line, her hand raised in a silent signal, her fingers stained with the grime of 1,000 mechanical adjustments and the persistent residue of black powder. The men around her were shaking their eyes, darting between the trail and the crude iron tubes they held in their white-knuckled grips. They had spent weeks training in the dark, learning to reload by touch alone. But the reality of the kill was a different beast altogether. As the soldiers came into the killing zone, their laughter echoing through the humid air as if they were on a Sunday stroll, Neves felt a strange and cold detachment. She was no longer the woman who bled in the village square. She was a primary component in a machine of her own, making a weapon designed for the sole purpose of extraction. When she finally brought the hammer down, the explosion was a physical blow to the chest, a roar of black powder that tore through the canopy like a lightning strike. The lead soldier did not even have time to raise his Arisaka rifle before a handful of rusty nails and lead scrap shredded his torso, turning his mustard-yellow uniform into a crimson rag and sending him backward into the mud with the force of a falling tree. The chaos that followed was a blur of smoke and screaming as the other guerrillas found their courage and unleashed their own improvised volleys from the heavy iron pipes. Each discharge sent a cloud of acrid white smoke into the air, obscuring the targets, but the proximity was so close that missing was nearly impossible. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood, but Neves remained the steady eye of the storm. She moved through the white haze like a wraith, her long bolo knife unsheathed and glistening in the dappled sunlight that broke through the mahogany leaves. When one of the collaborators tried to crawl away into the brush, his hands clawing at the dirt, in a desperate attempt to escape the reaper, she was upon him in a heartbeat. The blade found the soft tissue of the throat with a precision that was more surgical than emotional, reflecting the hours she had spent studying the anatomy of the enemy. This was the crucible, where the theory of resistance met the bloody reality of the slaughter, and Neves found that she did not flinch from the sight of the dead. As the silence returned to the jungle, her men looked at her with a new kind of terror and respect, realizing that the woman they followed was something more than human. They saw the blood on her hands and the lack of remorse in her eyes, and they understood that the schoolteacher was a memory buried beneath the weight of necessity. The successful ambush provided them with something more valuable than morale, as they recovered 3 functional rifles, several bandoliers of ammunition, and a crate of rations. It was the first harvest of many, and as they retreated back into the green shadows, Neves began to calculate the cost of an empire in terms of individual lives, taken one jungle trail at a time. As the weeks turned into months, the legend of the woman in the dress began to spread through the Japanese barracks like a slow-burning fever. They called her the silent teacher, or the ghost of the brush, and the once arrogant patrols began to move with a frantic and desperate caution that bordered on paranoia. The Crucible had forged a unit that was no longer a band of peasants, but a surgical strike force that specialized in the art of the vanishing kill. Neves established a network of spies and lookouts that rivaled the finest intelligence agencies of the Allied powers, using children and elderly farmers to track every movement of the occupying forces. She knew when the Japanese officers were planning a raid before they had even finished their morning tea, and she knew which trails were being used to transport prisoners back to the coastal stockades. Her technical mastery of the terrain allowed her to set traps that were as much psychological as they were physical. She would leave a single school book or a piece of chalk in the middle of a trail, a silent calling card that sent the younger Japanese conscripts into fits of trembling anxiety. They knew that somewhere in the trees, the woman they had once mocked was watching them through the iron sights of a weapon they could not even identify. The doubt that had once plagued her men was gone, replaced by a fanatic devotion to a leader who seemed to possess the power of life and death over the entire province. She drilled them until they could move through the undergrowth without snapping a twig, and until their gas pipe guns were cleaned and oiled with the same reverence a priest would give to an altar. The turning point came in 1943, when the Imperial command in the region finally realized that they were not facing a disorganized rabble, but a master tactician who was systematically dismantling their authority. They placed a bounty of 10,000 pesos on her head, a staggering sum that was meant to tempt the desperate or the greedy into betraying the teacher. They printed posters with her face and distributed them in every market and every church, but the people of Leyte remained silent as the grave. To them, Neves was a saint of the shadows, a protector who had risen from the ashes of her own torture to reclaim their dignity and their future. The Japanese responded with a campaign of terror, burning entire villages and executing random civilians in the hope of flushing her out from the interior. But Neves did not take the bait. She understood with a coldness that bordered on the divine that to surrender now would be to validate every atrocity they had committed. She retreated deeper into the interior, drawing the enemy into a labyrinth of spiked pits and gas pipe ambushes that stripped them of their morale and their supplies. She taught her men how to survive on roots and rainwater, turning the jungle into their greatest ally while it became the greatest enemy of the invaders. The crucible was over, and the time for the slaughter had arrived as the Japanese commanders grew desperate enough to commit their elite reserves to a search and destroy mission that would lead them directly into the jaws of the teacher. The slaughter began in the winter of 1943, during a season of relentless tropical rain that turned the valleys of Leyte into a primordial soup of mud and decay. The Japanese had sent a reinforced company of nearly 200 men to root out the resistant stronghold in the northern ridges, convinced that their superior numbers and Type 99 light machine guns would finally end the reign of the schoolteacher. Neves, however, had other plans that involved the total annihilation of the force. She had spent the last month preparing a killing box in a narrow ravine where the vertical walls were slick with moss, and the only exit was a bottleneck of jagged rocks and dense thickets. She positioned her men on the high ground, their long guns loaded with the heaviest loads of scrap and glass they could manage, and their bolo knives sharpened to a razor edge. As the Japanese column entered the ravine, their heavy equipment bogging down in the mire and their officers shouting orders that were lost in the wind, Neves watched from a hidden outcrop, her face a mask of stone. She waited with a patience that was terrifying until the entire unit was packed into the center of the trap, until the soldiers were shoulder to shoulder and their path of retreat was cut off by a controlled landslide triggered by her sappers. Then she whispered a single word of command, and the world turned into a furnace of iron fire and death. The first volley from the gas pipes was a coordinated roar that echoed between the ravine walls like 100 claps of thunder sounding at once. The Japanese soldiers were caught in a crossfire of jagged metal that ignored their helmets, and their body armor shredding their ranks in a matter of seconds. Neves did not stop with the first volley. She had her men rotate their positions in a continuous cycle of reload and fire, ensuring that there was never a gap in the carnage for the enemy to regroup. The ravine became a slaughterhouse, the air so thick with the smoke of black powder that it was impossible to see more than 5 feet ahead. The screams of the wounded and the dying were drowned out by the rhythmic thud of the improvised guns and the wet sound of bolo knives meeting flesh as her men descended the slopes to finish the job. When the Japanese tried to charge up the slick slopes in a desperate counterattack, they found themselves falling into pits lined with sharpened bamboo stakes that had been poisoned with the rot of the jungle and the waste of the camp. It was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a systematic execution of an entire company, and at the center of it all stood the woman in the dress, directing the flow of the blood like a conductor in an orchestra of the damned. She watched as the pride of the Imperial Army was ground into the mud, her eyes reflecting the cold satisfaction of a debt finally being paid in full. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the ravine was a graveyard of 200 men. Not a single Japanese soldier escaped the killing box to tell the tale. Neves walked through the wreckage, her boots stained a deep purple as she surveyed the results of her engineering. She found the commanding officer pinned beneath a dead horse, his white gloves now a sickening shade of brown, and his face contorted in a mask of agony. He looked up at her with eyes full of a primal recognition, realizing too late that the woman he had laughed at in the town square was the architect of his demise and the master of his fate. Neves did not say a word, and she did not offer the mercy of a quick death until she had looked him in the eye for a long, silent minute. She simply raised her bolo knife and ended his life with a single, clean stroke of the blade. This was the absolute peak of her campaign, the moment when the resistance became a legend that would be whispered about for 100 years in the mountains of the Philippines. The slaughter at the ravine broke the back of the local occupation, and for the first time in 3 long years, the people of Leyte felt the possibility of a world without the shadow of the rising sun. Neves Fernandez had taken the insult they had thrown at her and turned it into a mountain of corpses that the jungle would eventually swallow whole. The aftermath of the war did not bring the peace that Neves had once taught her students to hope for in their daily lessons. When General Douglas MacArthur finally waded through the surf at Leyte in October 1944, he found a province that had already been half liberated by a woman with a gas pipe, a bolo, and a blood grudge. The United States military officers were stunned to discover that a single school teacher had led a force that accounted for the deaths of over 200 enemy combatants in a single engagement. They saw her standing amongst her men, her floral dress long ago replaced by a rugged uniform of canvas and leather, and they saw the scars on her shoulders that the boiling water had left behind as permanent reminders of her transformation. They tried to give her medals and parades, and they tried to categorize her as a minor civilian auxiliary. But Neves had no interest in the theater of the victors or the bureaucracy of the new government. She had done what was necessary for the survival of her soul and the protection of her people, and she was ready to return to the shadows from which she had emerged. The transition back to civilian life was a slow and agonizing process, as the ghosts of the men she had killed followed her into the quiet rooms of her new schoolhouse, whispering to her in the dead of night about the price of her victory. In the years that followed, the image of Neves Fernandez became a haunting icon of the resistance, a symbol of the underdog who refused to roll over. There is a famous photograph of her from 1944 showing her in a simple dress, holding a long bolo knife, while a young American soldier looks on in a mix of awe and visible discomfort. In that image, you can see the two women she had become over the course of the conflict. One is the teacher, the gentle soul who believed in the power of the word and the potential of the youth. The other is the ghost, the reaper of the jungle who had mastered the art of the gas pipe and the terrifying silence of the kill. She returned to the classroom teaching a new generation of children about the history of their nation and the importance of sovereignty, but she never spoke of the ravine or the scent of sulfur in the rain. She remained a quiet and dignified figure in the community, a woman who walked the streets of Tacloban with a dignity that commanded respect, but a distance that no one dared to cross. The students noticed that she always kept a long knife nearby in her desk, and that she never flinched at the sound of a loud noise or the sudden movement of a stranger. They didn't know the gruesome details of her service, but they knew that they were free because of the teacher who refused to be broken by the weight of an empire. Neves Fernandez died in 1997 at the age of 91, carrying her secrets to the grave with the same iron discipline she had used to hold her breath in the jungle. She never asked for a veteran pension, and she never wrote a memoir to capitalize on her fame. She was the silent sentinel of Leyte, a woman who had been underestimated by an empire and had used that very arrogance to bury it in the mud of her homeland. Her legacy is not found in the grand bronze statues of the Capitol or the glossy textbooks of the great universities, but in the soil of the islands and the freedom of the children who play in the village square. She proved that the most dangerous weapon in any war is not the tank or the airplane, but the human spirit that refuses to accept the chains of an invader. The woman in the dress had killed 200 men, and in doing so, she had saved the soul of a nation from being extinguished. As the sun sets over the Leyte Gulf today, the low rhythmic drone of the waves sounds like a distant echo of her gas pipe, firing in the dark, a reminder that the teacher is still watching, and that the ghosts of the ravine have finally found their peace in the deep green silence of the history books. She remains the ultimate proof that the greatest mistake an enemy can make is to assume that a woman in a dress is anything less than a storm waiting to happen.